Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the West is Best show. I'm coming back because my laptop has started working again, so that's pretty cool. And I can look at my notes again, and I'm trying a new format with this sort of boring still image, but it's better than my old format because I look really, really bad. So, yeah. And I was originally just going to do this as part of a response to the whole video that this list is from Kevin Logan. But I made that video and just included this in there, and it made the video way too long, so I decided to make this its own video. And I really hate this list, and I need to debunk it because it is so terrible. And I really hate this video, so be watching for the whole video response. I'll release that fairly soon. And yeah, I hope you enjoy. I hope you like the new format, and I'm going to play the list. Alright, so he starts out with the transatlantic slave trade. I've already made a video about this. I'm not going to go into another 10 minutes talking about why this shouldn't be on this list. So we're going to go on to the Bengal famine of 1700 to 1773. I think it was supposed to be 1770. I may have made a typo there. But the Bengal famine, I'm going to just mention them quickly because the famines are all sort of similar. I'm going to talk about the Irish potato famine in a little bit more detail, but basically, these were horrible natural disasters that killed millions of people, and the British government did not cause them. I'm also going to talk about the Bengal famine of 1943 more because there's a lot of context and information there. But the Bengal famine of 1773, it was, and as well as most of the famines of the 19th century, they were awful, horrible natural disasters where millions died. Tens of millions died. And the British government didn't do a lot to help, which was bad, but they certainly didn't cause it, and they did do something to help with all of these famines, just not nearly enough because they took capitalism a little bit too far. But him blaming all these deaths on the British isn't very good to do. Next up, we have something that I've noticed a lot. He mislabels a lot of stuff to make it sound worse, and it made it a lot harder to research because a lot of this stuff made it, I couldn't find this stuff very easily, and I had to change around a lot of search terms, but these next two are both battles of the Revolutionary War that he labeled massacres. You have the Battle of Paoli, which I may have mispronounced, which he called the Paoli Massacre of 1777, and the Battle of Waxhaw, which he said was the Waxhaw Massacre. These were battles of the Revolutionary War. They were not massacres, and him labeling that was wrong. This was combat where both sides were fighting each other. Next up, we have the first massacre, and sorry for the pronunciation here, but of Macherlecu in 1793. This was bad of the French to do, but this was not during a good time in French history, and they were revolting during the War of the Vendée, and as we'll see as this list goes on, revolting during war is not a good thing, and this wasn't exactly justified, but it wasn't exactly evil either. And next up, we have the Gilbert Rath Massacre of 1798, which was bad, but this is sort of how war was back then. And we did this exact same thing to the Confederates, just on a way larger scale. This was an Irish revolt, and it was an awful thing that happened, but that was war. That is war, and it was effective in putting it down. The Siege of Jaffa, or I think it also can be pronounced Gotha, was in 1799, and the French tried to end it quickly and peacefully, and they sent an ambassador into the city to negotiate terms of surrender, but they beheaded the ambassador and put his head on a pike for the French army to see to show, and they said that there will be no negotiations and they'll fight to the death. And they did, and they lost. And then the Haitian slave genocide of 1801. This was a slave revolt where the slaves killed all the whites. The French didn't kill people. The French were killed, and for the most part, a lot of the French who were killed, that's fair enough. They revolted against their masters, and that was justified of them to do. But they also went a little bit further and killed women and children without quarter, and no white person was really spared from this horrible massacre of innocent people. And it was really bad that Kevin Logan blames the French for all the deaths of their own. I mean, that's pretty much victim blaming. Like, yeah, they kind of had it coming, but at the same time, killing women and children isn't quite okay when you're revolting against a tyrannical power. The Tasmanian Genocide of 1804 to 1835. This one is, he's somewhat right here. This was bad, but whites were being murdered by the natives there, white settlers, and they didn't come out and were like, hey, this is our territory, you guys gotta leave. No, they just came out and killed the white settlers. And the British government gave bounties for prisoners, not dead. They did soon after start giving bounties for dead, but prisoners were more valuable to the British government, and they tried to keep violence to a minimum, despite the fact that it continued to happen. And next up, sorry, I'm trying to go through as quick as we can because there's a lot here. Next up, we have the Peninsula War of 1808 to 1814, and I'm going to have to sort of derail here. France in the 19th century is an incredibly difficult topic to discuss because it flip-flopped around between different types of government. I'm going to probably make a video about 19th century France, but when I'm talking about, like, colonial France, I try and keep Napoleon out of it because he was an evil man and did a lot of terrible things and wasn't exactly what I would consider a good colonialist. And he didn't lead France to greatness. He led it to defeat and murdered a lot of people along the way. And this next one up here is the Peninsula War, which was his war. It was a guerrilla war. So the Spanish and the Portuguese were fighting back against the French. This wasn't just them rounding people up and executing them, though that did happen, and this was Napoleon, so it was kind of bad. But it was a war, and while it wasn't good of them to do, it was significantly better than a lot of the things Napoleon did. Peterloo Massacre, this was done by the British. This is one where I'll concede to Kevin Logan. This one was just awful. I think it was 13 people died. It was awful, but that's one I'll concede on. It was just awful. There's nothing more to it. The Algerian Genocide, this was another one that was mislabeled. This is the Algerian colonization from 1830 to 1875. This was a colonial war. The Algerians fought back hard, and this sort of goes back to Kipling's Savage Wars of Peace. This was brutal, but it led Algeria to become far better than it was before. Next up is one of my personal favorites that Kevin included on the list because it is a total lie. This is the Mall Creek Massacre. This did happen. It was in 1839 in Australia. 10 British colonists went out, and these were civilians, murdered quite a few natives. The British government tried and hung 7 of the 10 murderers and did not want this to happen. This is basically like blaming the U.S. government for the Aurora Theater shooting. Like, yeah, this was done by British people, but it was illegal, and the British government punished them for it, and he blames the British government for it, which is despicable, of course, and very wrong. And next up, we have the Irish Potato Famine. This is similar to the Indian famines. The British government did try and do actually quite a lot here. It just wasn't... They were being too capitalistic at a time where this was a crisis, and the government did need to step in and interfere in the economy. And it was awful these people died, but the government isn't to blame here. They were staying out of it, which is, I mean, they shouldn't have been, but you can't blame them for not doing something. Next up, we have the Boulevard des Capucines. I probably butchered that. This was in 1848. I could not find a single thing on this on the internet, and this, I don't know where this came from, but perhaps it was another mislabeled thing, and I just couldn't find it. So yeah, the Osira famine, another Indian famine, horrible natural disaster, tragedy, but the British government is not to blame. The suppression of the Paris Commune in 1871. This was a rebellion. Only 6,000 were confirmed, but estimates are up to 10,000 casualties. 877 of these were killed. 6,454 were wounded, and 183 were missing. The Madras famine, another Indian famine, horrible tragedy, but the British government is not to blame. The Fusillade des Fourmines, I probably butchered that one, in 1891. This is another one where I'm going to concede to Kevin Logan. This was terrible. These were peacefully striking miners. 9 of them were killed by the French government for striking, and it was awful. The invention of the concentration camp in 1899. Now, this is one in the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902. This is another one that you hear all the time against the British Empire, and it's really not that... It's stupid once you start doing research on it. Yes, by definition, these were concentration camps. They rounded up a concentration of people and put them into one camp. The British did not invent this. They were the first to use the name concentration camp, but anytime there's been an empire that has multiple ethnic groups at one point or another, they generally tend to round up a concentration of these people and put them in the same place. And when we use the term concentration camp, it's in the context of Nazi Germany, and it means death camp. And these were not intended death camps, and this leads to the Second Boer War. In these concentration camps, over 20,000 Boers died. And that may seem like a death camp, but it's important to note how these people died, and the fact that the British guards guarding these camps, 15,000 of them died. And these were all deaths from starvation and disease. And the fact that there's not one guard for every prisoner, and the fact that over 20,000 Boers died and 15,000 British soldiers died, that shows that the British were being quite generous with their supplies and taking probably equal casualties, if not higher casualty rate, than the Boers imprisoned there. And the reason why they couldn't get food and medicine to these camps was because the Boers were attacking the supply lines, so the British couldn't feed the civilians in the camps. He also uses the use of chemical weapons in 1915, but it's interesting to look at what else was happening in 1915. It was the middle of World War I, and the Germans had begun using chemical weapons. And this, honestly, it led to the reason why... This was the reason why chemical weapons weren't used in combat in World War II, because the Germans knew that, if we do this, it'll be like World War I. If we gas the British are going to gas us back. This was sort of similar to MAD. It caused it from happening again, and the Germans did it first, which isn't the greatest argument, but if they're going to use such a devastating weapon, it's wise of the British and French to use the same devastating weapon. The Amritsar Massacre. This one was bad, but this always used to be the one that I thought I would always concede on. This was just plain awful. But then I started doing some research on it and found a lot of very interesting stuff. This really is not anything close to the worst British massacre. This was, in the context of Germany, this was in 1919, which just after the armistice was signed, but technically the war was still going. This was before the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans had caused an insane amount of revolts, or attempted revolts, in the colonies of both Britain and France, and there had been riots across India the previous weeks, and posters were put up around the city telling fellow Indians to fight and die and kill the British to push them out. There were attempts made to rush the civil lines. Bricks were being thrown at the British troops. 6 British civilians were beaten to death by the mob. It's often said that there were a lot of women marching in it and the British fired on them. But there were actually very few women, which doesn't make it okay, but saying there was a lot is wrong. And the next day, Sikh priests praised the British. This really wasn't that bad of a shooting. It was mostly justified. They went a little bit overboard and killed way more than they should have, but they were being assaulted. 6 British civilians had been beaten to death, and they were attacking them, and the Sikhs praised the British for defending the city and keeping the order. The Choke Park Massacre of 1920, this is part of Ireland, and this was part of a larger war, and putting it in the context of the war, this was wrong, but when you put it in the context of the war, it's not quite as bad. The Shawkey Massacre, I may have mispronounced that, of 1925. There were soldiers and civilians marching against the Western troops, and the Western troops did hear gunfire in their direction before they fired on the crowd. This was bad, but it wasn't necessarily evil. The Western military here, they believed they were under attack and fought back. I'm probably going to mispronounce this. The Kisa Kinwani Bazaar Massacre in 1930. Rocks were being thrown at the British. A British rider was taken off his horse, killed, and his corpse was burned. And the rioters refused to disperse when the British had told them multiple times, you need to disperse because you're being violent and attacking us and rioting. So they did respond with deadly force after that. All right, here we get into World War II. The Vietnamese famine of 1945. He blames this on the French. What else was happening in 1945, especially in Indochina and Vietnam? Well, Japan had conquered and occupied it, and by 1945, they actually killed all of the Vichy government that was there, so you can't even blame the Vichy French for this, who were the Nazi puppets. This was purely the Japanese. They realized the war was lost and were trying to cause as much damage to the French colonies as possible, so they starved the people into submission. And he blames the French for this, and I don't know why I do know why he would do that, to demonize them and make colonialism look as bad as possible, even when it wasn't them doing it. This is another lie that makes me somewhat angry that he blames the French for this. The Bengal famine of 1943. This is not like the others. There's a lot going on here. 1943 was in the middle of World War II. India was under attack by Japan. Bengal was the front lines. Burma had fallen for the most part, and Japan, the British, they had to send most of the food from Bengal to the front lines to fuel the British troops because otherwise Japan would take over. He requested the Dominion of Canada, offered Churchill, they said, hey, we'll send wheat over, and Churchill said, no, we're under Japanese blockade. Any wheat that would make it through would not be anything close to enough, and it wouldn't be worth the loss of life and material for the war. And then in 1944, Churchill wrote to Roosevelt and asked him to send wheat from America, but Roosevelt said, we can't afford that wheat, we can't afford to send those ships there because D-Day was about to happen and they needed ships for D-Day rather than to send grain to India. And the British were taking the grain from the Bengalese to keep the fate of Nanking, which we'll talk about in my video responding to the whole of Kevin Logan's video. But they were trying to keep the horrible fate that Japanese conquest would mean for Bengal. And honestly, starving to death is a way better thing to happen than to be occupied by Imperial Japan. The Thyroid Massacre, I may have mispronounced that, in 1944. This was a bunch of French colonial troops mutinying. And war, especially World War II, is not a good time to mutiny. These mutineers took a French general hostage, and this was right before the liberation of France. France was very busy. There was actually a huge threat of civil war in France, so they couldn't really deal with putting down revolts in the colonies. And this whole thing happened. They took a French general hostage right before the liberation of France when he would be needed. And this was just terrible timing, and the only reason this happened is they just didn't trust France to pay them. This wasn't like the French were doing horrible things to them, they just were suspicious and mutinied at the worst time possible. This wasn't good that this happened, but that's war. When you revolt during the middle of a war, terrible things will happen. Sétif in 1945. This was an illegal celebration in Algeria. There were riots, and 90 French settlers were murdered by these people. This wasn't good, but again, it was justified. The Hang Bun Massacre in 1946 in Vietnam. The only information I could find on this was Wikipedia and a timeline, and all that I could find is this happened. I don't know any of the context, don't know what happened, but all that I could find is Wikipedia saying that it did indeed happen. The Haiphong incident in 1946. Vietnamese rebels murdered a massive number of French and civilians, and the French were not targeting civilians, but the Vietnamese rebels were hiding amongst civilians, and so the French did end up killing quite a few. This sort of goes back to war is hell, and civilians will die no matter what, and it's sad that it happens. I'm probably going to mispronounce this one as well. My Track Massacre in 1947. This is another one I'll concede on. This was just plain wrong of the French to do. The Batang Kali Massacre of 1948. Accounts on this differ wildly. One villager said that the village was helping the communists, and many of the soldiers in the incident were, they said that the villagers were trying to escape during interrogation, and that would imply that they were helping the communists. This one, there's a lot of... It's hard to say what the actual facts were. Whether or not the British were justified in doing this, it's hard to say. And judging by their track record, they probably were justified, even if this was brutal. That's how war is, and it definitely was back then. And they likely were justified, judging by their track record, but there were probably some innocent people killed. That one, it's up to your opinion, mostly, is what I would say, because it's so hard to get actual facts, because both sides are kind of biased, and there wasn't much information on it in the first place. The Mau Mau Uprising, also known as the Kenya Emergency, from 1952 to 1960. The rebels killed 32 European civilians and 1,800 African civilians. And these are the rebels that the British were fighting. Kevin Logan stated that 1,900 were killed by the British. The British only killed 68. The rest were the rebels murdering innocent, unarmed people. And several cases of bad things that happened during this uprising were persecuted. British troops were persecuted for doing bad things, but overall, this rebellion should have been put down, and they murdered the vast majority of people. The British only killed 68 enemy rebels in 8 years of conflict, and 1,800 people were African civilians murdered by the rebels, which he blames the British for doing because, you know, he doesn't care about facts. He just wants to say that the British murdered a lot of people they didn't. And he doesn't want you to research this list because this was pretty simple stuff to find. I just looked up these incidents and I got all this. And he made it hard to research on, I would guess, on purpose. He doesn't want you to research it because it all falls apart when you do. The Obalai Massacre of 1953. I could only find a Wikipedia page on this that said off-duty paratroopers were attacked and 5 were wounded and police pulled them back. The Chuka Massacre of 1953. This is part of the Kenya Emergency. Sorry, there's a lot of information I'm not sure about here. This was not an official government action by the British. The British government gave comp pay to the victims, and this was bad, but it wasn't the British government doing this. This was a loyalist paramilitary. The Battle of Philippeville, which he labeled as the Philippeville Massacre, of course. This was in 1955, and get this, 123 unarmed civilians were massacred by the rebels. I think this might be the massacre he was talking about, but these were the rebels that the French killed, not the French, and he blames the French for it, which, I mean, he's blamed some dumb stuff on the British and French that they completely didn't do, so I wouldn't be surprised if he blames more innocent French people being murdered on the French. But the French said that 1,273 rebels were killed during this. Kevin said low 1,300. And the terrorists said that 12,000 were killed, but I don't know if I would believe the word of these terrorists who murdered 123 unarmed civilians. The Cypriot internment from 1955 to 1953. I have no idea where he got the 3,000 people tortured, But food and medicine wasn't very good. There was poor conditions, but the British government quickly tried to get better food and medicine. This was similar to the Boer camps, but better, and they were well supplied. And honestly, there's some interesting images you can find online of happy Jewish women being interned, well, probably not happy, but content Jewish women being interned, learning how to sew. The British tried to make it as pleasant as possible for these poor people, and they knew that it sucked, and it did suck, but the British really did try, and claiming that 3,000 people were tortured, I couldn't find any statistics about that, but this really wasn't that bad. The British tried to make it as good as possible, and yeah. The Hola Massacre of 1959. This was part of the Kenya emergency, and this was another one that I will concede on. But this caused major change in the way the British persecuted the war, and it caused legitimate reform in the British military and government. So they actually did something about it, and he doesn't bring that up, of course, because saying that the colonial powers were moderate and actually, tried to make things better, that wouldn't fit his narrative. Alright, so next up we have the Paris Massacre of 1961. If you can't tell, I'm tired of this because so much of it is lies and half-truths, but next up we have the Paris Massacre of 1961. This was a pro-NLF group. There were bombings. This was after curfew. The police chief of Paris was actually persecuted by the French government after this happened because it was as bad as it was, and the official toll was 40 up to 200, but Kevin said that it was exactly 200 and that there wasn't any less, even though that's disputed. The low was 40, the high was 200, and he said, yeah, of course it was the high because he wanted to make it look as bad as possible. The Bab el Oued siege, I butchered that horribly, I'm sorry, of 1962. This was a battle where the French had 5 less deaths than the enemy and 17 more wounded, and these were anti-peace terrorists that they were fighting. This was a battle. This was not a massacre, and they were fighting the terrorists. They were fighting terrorists. The Aden emergency, I'm going to make an entire video about this because this is a really interesting topic, and I could dive really deep into it, so I'm going to in a future video, so just watch out for that. Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide in 1994. He blames the French for the 1 million people who were killed there. That's despicable. The French did leave behind some weapons and equipment for the side that did commit the genocide, with no intention for them to commit a genocide, and blaming the French. The genociders did use French equipment that was not intended for genocide, and he blames the French government for the 1 million deaths, not the people who did it. He's blaming the tools used as the killers, and the men who made the tools as the killers, which is terrible. And then another one of my favorites, the Ivory Coast hostilities in 2004. 2004, after France was a colonial power. Don't know why this is on the list, but it is, so I'm going to talk about it, and it's kinda stupid. The Ivory Coast and the French had clashes, and the Ivory attacked the French, and the French responded by destroying the Ivory Coast's air force to prevent a full war. This was not a massacre. This was after France was a colonial power, and this was them flexing their muscles on a weak country trying to fight them to show, like, hey, if you do try and start a war with us, we're gonna win. I'm sorry, my research on this wasn't perfect. I researched this a long time ago, but the video turned out very poorly, and there's some stuff I left out here. This list makes me angry, and do research on this on your own, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff. I had to leave out a lot. I'm trying to be as brief as possible because this list just made me so angry. I knew I had to make a video on it, and I'm also sick, so sorry about my voice, but I hope you did enjoy this. I hope you have a good morning, good evening, or good night, and thank you for watching. And please do research on this, because I could have definitely have gotten some stuff wrong, and I apologize if I do, and I hope to see you in my next video. And if you're wondering about the video about the Aiden emergency, it'll probably be something along the lines of Mad Mitch or Aiden, so keep an eye out for that, and I will catch you in the next video. Also, watch Kevin Logan's video. This list is from his video of Descent of Manosphere the Britisher, so check out that whole video, and I'm going to be making a response to that whole video as well fairly soon here, so